The coalition that made Donald Trump president twice is fracturing, not at the edges, at the foundation. Rural America, the Corn Belt, the Grain Belt, the soybean fields, the farmsteads, voted for Donald Trump at a higher rate in 2024 than at any point in his political career. He swept 64% of rural voters nationally. In Iowa alone, he won by 13 points. These were his people, his base, the voters who believed more than anyone that he would fight for them. And now they are leaving. On the surface, this looks like a polling story, a few bad approval numbers, a temporary dip, the kind of thing that gets covered for 48 hours and then buried under the next news cycle. But underneath what is actually happening is a structural collapse of the rural Republican alliance that has been building for 30 years. And if you understand what is driving it, the specific economic forces, the specific agricultural pressures, the specific war that nobody voted for, you will understand why this is not a temporary dip. This is a realignment. And the first place it shows up on a map is Iowa. There is one more piece to this story that almost nobody is connecting, because there is a third variable in this political equation, one that should be helping Democrats capitalize on Trump's collapse, but instead threatens to turn a potential wave into a trickle. His name is Joe Biden, and we are going to cover all of it. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to show you cuts across 3 simultaneous political earthquakes happening in the same news cycle. And when you understand how they connect, you will not look at the 2026 midterms the same way again. Here is the version of this story you got from mainstream media. Trump's approval ratings are down, rural voters are unhappy about tariffs, Democrats might have a chance in Iowa. The Iran war is unpopular, Joe Biden is unpopular. These were the headlines. Clean, simple. Each story treated as its own contained unit. What mainstream coverage did not do was connect them. On the rural revolt story, the coverage began and ended with tariffs. Tariffs bad, farmers angry, Trump down in polls. That is accurate. It is also about 20% of what is actually happening. On the Iran war story, coverage focused almost entirely on the military and geopolitical dimensions. The approval numbers got a paragraph. The connection to rural economic anxiety, specifically how fuel and fertilizer costs tied to Middle Eastern energy disruptions are hitting farmers on top of tariff damage, barely existed in any major outlet. On the Biden story, coverage framed it as a legacy question. How will history remember him? What does his memoir say? What does the book tour mean politically? That framing misses the real question entirely, which is structural. What does a historically unpopular former president do to a party that desperately needs to consolidate its base in a midterm election? Here is where most coverage stopped. What was actually happening was this. 3 separate political forces were converging simultaneously in the same geographic and electoral space. Rural economic collapse, an unpopular war that is accelerating rural cost pressures, and a former Democratic president so toxic that his continued public presence actively undermines the party trying to benefit from Republican vulnerabilities. That is the real story. And here is what was happening underneath that surface. To understand what is happening in rural America right now, you need to understand one number that did not make many headlines. Iowa's gross domestic product fell 6.1% in the first quarter of 2025, annualized. That was one of the steepest GDP declines of any state in the country at that point. Iowa, one of the most reliably Republican states in America, a state that has not elected a Democratic governor since 2006, a state that has not elected a Democratic senator since 2008. That is the ground on which this story is playing out. Now, Donald Trump is not a politician who came to rural America as a stranger. He went there repeatedly. He knew the language. He knew what farmers needed to hear. In 2024, he won rural white voters nationally by 30 points. He told them he would fight for American agriculture. He told them trade wars were winnable. He told them the pain would be temporary and the gains would be permanent. But here is the thing about farmers. They do not operate on news cycles. They operate on commodity prices, input costs, land debt, and generational business models that have been stressed for decades. When the numbers do not work, they know it. You cannot talk a corn farmer out of a balance sheet, and the balance sheet right now is catastrophic. Chapter 12, Family Farm Bankruptcies. These are the filings designed specifically for family farming operations, surged 46% in 2025 nationally, according to the American Farm Bureau Federation. 315 filings, the second consecutive year of sharp increases. In Iowa specifically, farm bankruptcies jumped by 220% between 2024 and 2025. 220% in a single year. The average Iowa farmer is now over 57 years old. These are not new operators who took on bad debt at a bad time. These are multi-generational farming families who survived the farm crisis of the 1980s, when land values collapsed by a third nationally and 110,000 jobs evaporated in Iowa alone. And they are now filing for bankruptcy protection in numbers that economists are starting to compare to that crisis. Total farm debt nationally is forecast to reach a record $624.7 billion in 2026. Interest expenses alone are projected to hit $33 billion, a record. Nearly 40% more new farm operating loans were opened in the fourth quarter of 2025 compared to the same period in 2024. And the average loan was 30% larger, with a repayment timeline 3 months longer. That is what financial desperation looks like when it moves slowly enough to miss on the nightly news. And here's the part that connects directly to the Iran war. Fuel and fertilizer costs, two of the largest input expenses in American agriculture, are directly tied to global energy markets. The military conflict in the Middle East that began in February 2026 created energy disruption that pushed those input costs even higher at exactly the moment when farmers were already stretched to the breaking point on trade war damage. Farmers were not just caught in one economic storm, they were caught in two overlapping ones. And that is where this story becomes much bigger than most people realize. The polling shift that has emerged from all of this is not subtle, it is historic. Fox News polling, and I am using Fox News specifically because these are not numbers that organization has any incentive to overstate, shows that Donald Trump's net job approval among rural voters fell from plus 20 in early 2025 to minus 14 by May 2026. That is a 34-point swing. Among white rural voters specifically, his net approval fell from plus 27 to minus 6, a 33-point collapse among the exact voters who gave him his largest margins. Only 24% of white rural voters say the economy is in excellent or good condition. 77% rated as fair or poor. And here is the number that should stop every Republican strategist cold. Only 16% of rural white voters say their family's financial situation is better than it was 2 years ago, when Joe Biden was still president. 49% say they are worse off. Think about what that means. These are voters who chose Trump in 2024 precisely because they were unhappy with Biden's economy. And now, 18 months into Trump's second term, nearly half of rural white voters say their financial situation has deteriorated compared to the Biden years. That is not a polling problem. That is an accountability problem. And it is the kind of number that moves elections. On inflation specifically, the trust collapse is even more dramatic. Rural voters trusted Trump over Kamala Harris on inflation by 37 points in late 2024. According to the most recent available data, he is now 19 points underwater with those same voters on the same issue. That is a swing of over 50 points. This did not happen because rural voters became liberal. They did not. This happened because the economic promises that drove their votes in 2024 were not delivered. And the economic damage from the policy choices made in 2025 is now landing directly on their balance sheets. But here is where things become even more interesting, because this collapse is not only showing up in approval ratings, it is showing up in primary results. And it is showing up in ways that should alarm anyone who thinks the president's endorsement is still the most powerful force in Republican politics. Donald Trump's endorsement record in Republican primaries has been near perfect throughout his political career. He enters races, his candidate wins, the other candidate concedes. It became one of the most reliable storylines in American politics. The idea that crossing Trump meant electoral death and backing him meant electoral life. Iowa just interrupted that story in a way that deserves more attention than it received. In the Iowa Republican gubernatorial primary, Trump endorsed Randy Feenstra, a sitting congressman. Feenstra was considered the safe, establishment-backed candidate. Trump's endorsement was expected to be decisive, the way it had been decisive in race after race across the country. But Feenstra ultimately conceded the race. The winner, Zach Lawn, who will now face Democrat Rob Sand in November, won despite Trump's intervention on the other side. What is significant here is not just who won, it is what the breakdown showed. Feenstra won absentee voters by 15 points. Among voters who cast their ballots on Election Day and were fully aware of Trump's endorsement, a different picture emerged. They moved toward lawn anyway. Iowa Republicans in this race were told what the president wanted, and a significant portion of them said no. That is not a normal data point. In Trump's political universe, that almost never happens. And it happened in Iowa, of all places, the state that was supposed to be safe ground. The structural story here is not about Randy Feenstra. It is about what it means when the president's endorsement magic fades in the exact geographic and demographic territory where it was supposed to be strongest. If it can fade in rural Iowa, it can fade anywhere. Now let me show you what that means for November. The last time Iowa elected a Democratic governor was 2006. The last time Iowa sent a Democrat to the Senate was 2008, when Tom Harkin won re-election. For the past 2 decades, Iowa has been a reliable Republican state in every major statewide race. What prediction markets are now pricing is a fundamental departure from that pattern. Rob Sand, Iowa's state auditor and the only Democrat currently holding statewide office in Iowa, is now favored on Kalshi and Polymarket to win the governorship. The odds as of this week put him at approximately 64% versus 34 to 36% for Republican nominee Zach Lahn. 1 year ago, in June 2025, Republicans were priced at a 71% chance to hold the governor's mansion. The entire probability distribution has flipped. Sand is not an ordinary Democratic candidate in a red state. He won his first statewide race in 2018 in a field that went heavily Republican everywhere else. He has cross-party appeal that most Democrats in deep red states simply do not develop. He has been building fundraising infrastructure for over a year, and he is running in an environment where Iowa's first quarter GDP collapsed 6.1%, farm bankruptcies more than tripled year over year, and the president who delivered those economic conditions is 34 points underwater in rural approval compared to where he was when Iowans voted for him. On the Senate side, Josh Turek's primary win has drawn Democratic optimism, even though prediction markets still favor Republicans, pricing the race at roughly 61 to 37 in favor of a GOP hold. But that gap is narrowing, and the mere fact that Democrats are competitive in both statewide races in Iowa simultaneously is itself the signal. It last happened in 2006, the year after Hurricane Katrina exposed the limits of a Republican presidency that had spent its political capital and left its coalition depleted. The parallels are not exact, they rarely are, but the structural logic is the same. And that is where the Biden variable enters this picture in a way that nobody is discussing with the seriousness it deserves. Every political realignment has a counter-narrative, a weight on the other side of the scale, something that slows the momentum or complicates the path. For Democrats heading into November 2026, that weight has a name. It is Joe Biden. The numbers here are not ambiguous. They are, in fact, historically anomalous. Net favorability of former Democratic presidents at a comparable post-presidency point. Barack Obama, plus 31, Jimmy Carter, plus 22, Bill Clinton, minus 3, Joe Biden, minus 19. Among independents alone, Biden sits 28 points underwater. That is not just the worst of any former Democratic president in 50 years of available data, it is categorically worse than anyone else in that group. Carter, who presided over stagflation, the Iranian hostage crisis, and an energy shock that defined economic misery for a generation, was still 22 points above water at this stage post-presidency. Biden is 41 points below Carter on this metric. The political implications of this are direct and documented. Biden's continued visibility, book tours, public appearances, media presence, reminds persuadable voters of what they were voting against in 2024. He is not an asset that can be deployed selectively. He is an anchor that operates whether Democrats want it to or not. And here is the second layer of this problem, which is less about Biden specifically and more about what his prolonged presence in office produced: institutional distrust within the Democratic coalition itself. Prediction markets are currently pricing a greater than 68% chance that 4 or more incumbent House Democrats lose their own primaries in 2026. For historical context, going back through every non-redistricting midterm election cycle available, the highest number of Democrats who lost their own primaries in a single cycle was 3. What is being priced now would set an all-time record. That is the sound of a base that does not trust the leadership that kept Biden in place for as long as it did. These primary challenges are not about policy disagreements in the traditional sense. They are a referendum on the party establishment's judgment. And the Biden presidency, specifically the decision to protect him past the point where the evidence of his decline was visible, is at the center of that referendum. The party that is supposed to be benefiting from Trump's rural collapse and Iran war unpopularity is simultaneously managing an internal credibility crisis of its own making. Now let us bring this to the level where it actually lands. If you are watching from Canada, and most of you are, this is not an abstraction. This is the political structure of your largest trading partner, your most consequential foreign policy relationship, and the country whose economic turbulence just hit your own supply chains. The rural revolt against Trump is directly tied to the same tariff and trade war dynamics that disrupted Canadian agriculture. Iowa soybean farmers and Canadian canola producers are not in the same economic situation, but they are being hit by the same structural forces. When American farm bankruptcies surge 46% and Iowa's GDP contracts 6.1% in a quarter, Canadian agricultural exporters feel the downstream effects in market disruption, pricing volatility, and the uncertainty that comes from watching your largest customer navigate an economic and political crisis simultaneously. The Iran war adds another layer. Canada, like America, has energy costs tied to Middle Eastern market disruptions. The ceasefire that is currently holding, and that 77% of Americans want to continue, including majorities of Democrats, independents, and even a portion of Republicans, is the single most stabilizing factor in the current global energy picture. A return to active hostilities would not stay in the Strait of Hormuz. It would land in fuel prices in Ontario and Quebec the same way it lands in fertilizer costs in Iowa. And the Biden legacy problem, while American in its specifics, speaks to a dynamic that Canada is not immune to. What happens when a political establishment protects its leadership past the point of credibility, and what the institutional hangover looks like when that decision becomes publicly visible. The level of anti-establishment energy now running through American Democratic primaries is a warning sign that any political party, including Canadian ones, should be watching. The people who feel this most directly are not in Washington. They are in Windsor, Ontario, watching auto sector trade policy change by executive order. They are in British Columbia, watching lumber tariffs reappear. They are in Saskatchewan, watching grain market access shift without warning. American rural revolt is Canadian economic uncertainty viewed from a different angle. Let me show you 3 scenarios for how this converges into November. I am not telling you which one wins. I am showing you what the structural incentives support. Scenario 1, the quiet wave. Rural economic anger combined with anti-war sentiment and democratic enthusiasm from the primary energy produces a genuine wave election in states like Iowa. Rob Sand wins the governorship. Josh Turek pulls off the Senate upset. Democrats net 15 to 20 House seats nationally. The Biden drag exists, but is overwhelmed by the volume of Republican defections. Iowa is the symbolic center of a realignment that analysts in 2024 said was structurally impossible. The structural incentives supporting this: 34-point rural approval collapse, 220% farm bankruptcy increase, historically low economic satisfaction, prediction market consensus already favoring the Democratic gubernatorial candidate. Scenario 2, the stall. Rural economic anger is real, but does not translate cleanly to Democratic votes. Farmers who are unhappy with Trump stay home rather than crossing party lines. Biden's continued visibility and the anti-establishment primary energy produce enough internal chaos that the national Democratic message loses coherence. Democrats gain seats but fall short of recapturing the House. Iowa stays competitive, but Republicans hold both the Senate race and the governorship in a late-breaking shift toward the familiar. The structural incentives supporting this: Iowa has not elected a Democratic senator in 18 years. Rural white voters leaving Trump does not automatically mean those voters choose Democrats. Turek's prediction market odds still favor Republicans in the Senate race. Scenario 3, the fracture. The political environment deteriorates further from here. The Iran ceasefire collapses. A second economic shock hits, possibly tied to energy markets or a credit event in the agricultural sector. Primary anti-establishment energy produces House Democratic losses that create a circular credibility crisis. The party that was supposed to benefit from Republican collapse becomes the secondary story, the party that could not hold its own coalition together. Iowa becomes a missed opportunity that analysts look back on as the moment Democrats could not organize around a clear message. The structural incentives supporting this: 68% prediction market probability on 4+ Democratic incumbents losing primaries. Biden's toxicity to independents. The historical difficulty of translating approval collapse into actual vote switching. I am not telling you this will happen. I am showing you what the structural incentives support. 3 questions I cannot answer, and nobody can yet. 1. Does Rob Sands' cross-party appeal hold through a general election in Iowa? Or does the partisan gravity of a state Trump won by 13 points ultimately pull the race back to the familiar pattern, regardless of how bad conditions get? 2. If the Iran ceasefire breaks down before November, does that help Trump by allowing him to reassert a commander-in-chief frame? Or does it accelerate the anti-war sentiment that is already driving independents away from him at 40 points underwater? 3. Can the Democratic Party manage its internal credibility crisis, the anti-establishment primary energy, the Biden legacy damage, the institutional distrust, simultaneously with capitalizing on what may be the most favorable electoral environment for opposition parties in a generation? I do not know. Nobody knows yet. At the beginning of this video, I told you that the coalition that made Donald Trump president twice is fracturing. Not at the edges, at the foundation. The foundation is rural America, the farmers and small towns and county seats that voted for him at a higher rate in 2024 than ever before because they believed he would fight for their economic reality. Their gross domestic product fell 6.1% in a single quarter. Their farm bankruptcies more than tripled in a year. Their fuel and fertilizer costs are higher because of a war they did not vote for. And their approval of the man they trusted with their livelihoods has swung 34 points in 18 months. That is what a broken promise looks like when it lands on people who run balance sheets for a living. Iowa in November 2026 is the first real test of whether that broken promise becomes a broken coalition. And the answer to that question will shape American and Canadian political and economic reality for the decade that follows. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because this story is not over. It is not close to over. Iowa's primary results just landed. The markets are moving. The ceasefire remains fragile, and the anti-establishment Democratic primaries have not finished playing out. The next move could come tomorrow. It could come tonight. And when it does, you will want to have been here from the beginning.